Hello, this is Max Drake. I want to talk about a follow-on from this one. So we did the ephemeris, we did a plot on that just to get the visualizations. We then did the moon, month and phases and the sunrise, and we then sent them all to a PDF and it's automated and then sent on to me via email. The next one is actually to do tide. So I actually have a tide table for down in Wellington. There's Lyall Bay. And so I thought, well, I'll add a tide table to this. So there's a couple of tide tables here. This one here, which is the Met Office, the Met Service actually has a tide table down the bottom through here. So we'll look in that in a little bit more depth. Anyway, I found a tide API. So I thought, well, since it's there, why not use it? So I signed up for it, got the API key, and decided to run it. So my idea here is to actually use the API, get the tides table, which I can do for about 10 days. And then I wanted to explore also using the FPDF library, get on there you, and start seeing if I can actually put some colors in there. So color in the header, put some colors in for either stripes or things like that. So just explain, start taking the PDFs a bit further. So there's a bit of learning as far as the tables go, because these are a lot more complicated. Whereas the ephemeris, we use the ephem library, and it was just a dream to actually do, very easy to do. With this one here, it ended up being a little bit difficult. So let's get on with it. So first of all, we just call the API. I've hidden away the key somewhere else so you can't see it. We call the data. I've given the lat long of where the beach is, and it's just got a request that comes through as JSON. The JSON comes through and it modifies it into a normal PDF, taking the JSON and convert it into a straight CSV, and then we send it out as a CSV. So I'm just going to hide these three lines at the moment. So when we actually run this one through here, is it running? I might have to kill that. I think I had something else running in the background. When we run this one through here and we get it, if we look at the tides that we get, this is how it comes through. So we actually get the date and the time all as a timestamp type thing, and we go to hours and minutes. We don't seem to have seconds. And then we've got values. So the values are minus numbers or plus numbers. So I'm thinking that you've got the mean sea level, and then the tide is going to drop below the mean sea level, or it's going to go above the mean sea level. So if it's a minus number, it's a low tide. If it's a number, it's a high tide. So anyway, I said to Mr. Bing, hey, I've got this stuff here in this format. Can you please write me a tide table that is based on each specific date? So every date, and there's going to be 4 tides in that date. So it came back and Mr. Bing decided to write me this. So it's using this other bits here to do with JSON stuff, so getting the API. So it imports pandas, and this one here, we're going to read the CSV file. Now, when it reads the CSV file, it wants to group by date, but we haven't actually got a date column in here. At this point in time, we've actually got a date and timestamp type thing, so I'd have to split that out. So I could actually do that within the script each time, or I could actually do that earlier on. So early on, I actually just decide to actually make 2 more columns, date and time. So if I run that through again, sorry, it gets a bit funny this. I'm going to close down. So here we go. It's just going to create the thing. So we look at that date time now. Now I've actually taken the time and I've split it into date. So it gives the date, and then I split it into time X, which is the time, because the initial column is called time. I just called it time, but we'll put an X on the end of it. So that's where I got the data at this point in time. Then I can run this program through here. So I get this one through here, and it writes out some stuff. So that's wonderful. So let's go and see what it writes out. So when we get the data, it writes it out into this format. So let's just take this data here. I'm going to a certain extent, I've done this already. I've been doing a couple of shots of this video. So it's got the date, and if we just go into home and we just go back into there, it's got basically low tide, time, low tide, height, high time, tide, high time, height, low time. So it's got the 2 lows and 2 highs. So on this one here, it's saying the first low tide is at 106, and this is the height, which is minus 43. The next tide is at 720, 712. The next one's at 1320, and the next one's, which is the low tide, and then the last one is 9045, and it's a high tide. And this worked great until we get down to this point here, where our high tide is earlier than our low tide. So it's not reading logically. It's actually reading high tide, then the wrong low tide, then the right high tide, and then the other tide down here. So suddenly it needs to be configured slightly different. So how do you do that? Because you can either have low tide first or high tide first. So I went back and reviewed some of the ways that they'd done this. And on this one here, if you note, they've actually got high tide, low tide, high tide, low tide, another high tide column. So when we actually look at this, you can see it goes, this one starts, so in the day, the first one is the low tide, and then high, then low, then high. And this happens right the way through till Saturday. And on Saturday, we only have 3 tides. We have a low tide, then a high tide, then a low tide. And then it shifts over, and then we have the high tide first, and that's when we fill out this first column. And if we start on the low tide, then we need an extra column to be able to put the next high tide through there. So I was suddenly thinking, well, we're going on a hiding to nowhere if we only have 4 columns for tides or for tides and such, or so there's 8 or 10 columns. So that needed a little bit of work on there. So I decided on this time to actually just use Bing Crosby to see if I could write the whole code. Not necessarily from a lazy's point of view, because it kept on getting buggy and I kept on not being able to quite describe what I wanted to, but just to see if it could. Now, a couple of things happened. One, it would sort of get into a loop and just keep on feeding back the same code. And the second thing which it ended up doing, so I'd actually quit that session, start a new session, start with the code again, and then try and be a bit more explicit about what I actually wanted to get it to do the code, but it would still leap through. It seems to get about it seems to get to a certain point where it can fix some things up, and then it just sort of locks it. It doesn't go any further. So it seems to be able to do a few steps when it's trying to work with logic. And so I suddenly thought, well, that's fine. That's a bit of learning. The other thing that actually happened was I used up all of my Bing Crosby singing time. And he suddenly said, I'm too tired. Call me tomorrow. You've used up more than thing. So I'd reached a limit. I think you can reach a limit, and a lot of the times when if you're with the Open API one, if you're just using the free version, it suddenly says we're too busy. We're doing the paying customers first, and you roughs come later. With this one, because I think it's all free at this point in time, it just suddenly said no, we've done a limit. But I was using it throughout the day, so I just really wanted to just talk about that aspect of things because I was trying to learn to see limitations and issues with using Bing Crosby. So this is as far as I got. So that was the first crack at the thing. I then suddenly thought, well, another thing that I want to ask about is what about doing some plots? So on this one here, I said, well, okay, then do me a plot. We got the data and do it. Now on this one here, I was suddenly saying, how can we do a plot and this and that and the other? And it's got MatplotLib and it's got SciPy optimized for curve fit, for finding a fit. Because what I was trying to do, at the top of this, you see this nice sinuous curve going all the way through here. And if we look at the other one, you see there's this nice sine curve type thing going up and down. Well, it's got a sort of a frequency curve. But you see all the peaks and the troughs aren't at the same line. They sort of end up being longer and stretchier through here, and here they're kind of closer together. And then in between these, they aren't the same height. So suddenly trying to fit this into a normal sine curve, I wasn't getting anywhere. So I thought, well, at this point in time, I'm not that bothered. We've got a sort of a straight jagged line for highs and lows through there. We'll leave it for this point in time. Let's just focus on getting the tables. So the next one that I started to do was also play with getting the PDF output. So I suddenly thought, well, I'll be playing with the tide and the thing. So when it was working to begin with, it takes the data, it looks at the date, and it says for a certain date. So it groups the data frame. First of all, it groups by date, and it groups all of the tides for that date. So normally you've got 4 of them, so each date has got 4 tides, we'll say. Then what it then says group by, we got this other one, we're going to say this thing called low tide, which is a list maybe, and it says group and smallest, and it says the 2 values, and then high tides group and largest. So if we actually just look at the tables, through here, you'll see we've generally got 4 per day. We don't seem to get any more than 4 per day, but sometimes we get 3. So when it does this group by smallest and group by n largest, that's fine if there's a consistent spread. In other words, you want the 3 smallest or the 2 smallest and the 2 largest. That works fine if there's 4. But what happens if it's 3? If it's 3, and let's say there's 2 low tides and 1 high tide, then the low tide is grouped correctly. You've got the first low tide and the second tide. But in the high tides, it groups the largest. So it groups the high tide on the first one, and it grabs the next low tide, because it's just taken the 2 in a list of 3. And so it doesn't work. It sort of breaks a bit. So once we've actually ordered, though, we then order by value. So which is the first low tide and which is the second low tide, so that we can order them when we start putting them into a script. So this was the issue with the first one, is that suddenly if it was a 3-day, what it was actually doing was printing out, so it'd take the high tide, and so one of the low tides would be printed out twice because it was in 2 different sets of grouping, the low tides and the high tides. So that was a bit of a difficulty that I actually ended up having to do. So going back to my original API one, I added another column on the end of this one here, and I just run this one through again. So this is the API call, and when we actually look at the tides 0, what this now does is it adds another column on the end, and it's just called tide. So it just says, is this a negative number? Then make it a 0, so it's a low tide. If it's a positive number, then make it a 1, so it's a high tide. And so we can use this column then, instead of using group n largest, group n smallest by the value, we can actually say low tides are if the tide one is either, if it's 0, and then on the other one. So we've got it by date, and then we've got a number of tides on there. Then all we do is just look at the tide columns and said, in the low wide ones, put in the 0 ones, in the high tide ones, match those. So that ended up being quite good. So to sort of jump to the chase, we'll do that in a minute. So the next thing I wanted to play with quite early on is I said, okay then, write me a class for the PDF, because I thought, well, write a class rather than just write me a table, because I thought if I got a class I might be able to use it again and again. As it is, I couldn't, but it was a sort of an exercise. So this one here, I said, because I had a class, I then went in and looked at the FPDF thing, and I said, I can then sell backgrounds. I actually want to have shaded backgrounds like this, and this is not based on a class. So I said to Bing, take this and convert it into my class one and see if you can actually give me shaded bits of data. So if I now run this one here, save, run, it runs through and it's doing it to tides 4. So let's go for tides 4. So on this one I've played around a bit, but here I've got zebra striped things, so I can actually shade the second row on what I want, and I also started to fade out the lines in the background as well to sort of and then the header I've made bold, or I think it's set up as bold anyway. So I've got the date, I've got the tides coming through, etc, etc, etc. So that's starting to look quite good. I then said, okay then, do me one where the columns are shaded. So I run this one here, and when we come through on this one's tides 3, so when we look at tides 3, this one has the columns. Now I've said make them alternating, but you can actually say make the first one unshaded, then make the next 2 shaded, then make the next 2 unshaded, then make the next 2 shaded, then make the next 2 unshaded, and then make that next 2 shaded again, so that you're only highlighting the shaded columns, and so that you can clearly differentiate between each. So that was one of the things I ended up doing, and that was quite useful. But when I tried to combine columns, so having all of the columns and then doing a colour into this cell and into this cell and into this cell to do the zebra stripes on alternating rows, it went mad on me. It didn't seem to want to do both the columns and the things, and I just ended up with a checkerboard all the way through, so it ended up being very messy. So in the end I had to make a call, and I said, well, okay, then I'm going to highlight the columns because it'd be easier to read. So I sort of ended up with the data in that format. So I then moved in, and you know, there were several iterations of this in a way, but this was the final way, and I'll walk through this one. So this is where I got to on this particular one. Doesn't seem to be doing it. We just close that and go run. Unexpected indent. No, it didn't have that unexpected indent before line 2. There's nothing on line 2. Save, run. Looks like we're going to get it this time. There we go. Okay then, so this one becomes tide 2. Tides 2. So this, oh sorry, I've got too many things on here. Let me just turn a couple of things off on here. So we really just want to look at the table through here. So on this table here, I was playing with some of the highlighting things that I can do. Now I can get a background for the title. I can alternate colours to have a strong colour and a lighter colour in the headers. I can then make the columns alternating through here. So this one here is quite good. The stronger colour ones are for high tides, and then the date and the low tides are actually they're just blank. So it's easy to kind of read or to track through. And in this one as well, when I actually looked at the table in here, I thought, well, actually, this is quite good. Instead of having 10 columns across for the number of different high tides, for the high tide time and the high tide height, I could actually just clump them into that and bring the have a single column. So I only have 5 columns. So initially I'd got a landscape mode, and I suddenly thought, well, actually I can go into a portrait mode. So when we look at this, another thing that I've got in here is I was trying to use a little bit of an emoji or something like that, and I got this arrow, so up arrows for high tides. They don't stand out too strongly at this point in time, but it was really just suddenly saying, well, I want to see if I can get the Unicode in there. So it was just sort of trying to push the FPDF2 process to try and see what enhancements I can actually add on that and the double column. Now I said I'd gone from having let's just see if I got anything in the other method. So I went from something where I got these 10 columns through here, and I said no, I only want 5. Can you write it so I can do 5? And Bing came up with this solution that I thought was absolutely elegant, and what it actually did was it read the first high tide time one. So it created a new column on the end of my data frame, and it took the first one, high tide time 1, and it changed it into a string, and then it added a new line, and then it added the high tide height 1 and changed that as a string. So I ended up with a string with a new line in the middle of it. So when we actually look at the tides column, instead of every single item that we got, like the first one, we've actually got the first low tide through here, because it starts with the low tide. The first one, which is the time, then we've got a new line, so the next part starts on the next line. So this is a CSV, so it looks rather weird. Instead of actually just running out here in the normal logical columns, it's actually just pushing down. So it's writing the next one, and then it's going on to a new line. Then it's writing the next one, going on to a new line, and writing the next one and going on to a new one. So that's how it's able to fit 2 things into the same column, which I thought was very elegant. So that was a fun thing to do. Now I just want to go back and look at this code overall. So when the code comes in, it's reading it from the CSV file. The first thing it does is it groups by date. So it says look up each date, and for every new date go and grab the number of tides that there are. So normally there's 4, there might be 3. And then for the low tides, only get the ones which actually has the tide column which is equal to 0. So that's a new column that we created at the end. And only for the high tides create the one. So we know that the low and high tides are going to be in their separate lists because of the fact that they're only, so one might only have one and the other one might have two, or they might both have two. So once we've got that, we then we've got a new row called date, and then it then has an if else statement through here. If the high tide's first column, so in here the high tides where we've got the first one here that we've then sorted by the time to get the earliest time to the later time. So the first one is always going to be the earliest time. So if the first earliest high tide is less than the first earliest low tide, then the first row that we start filling in information is in the high tide time one column, in the first column. But if so if that's the case, then the next column that we go over to is that we go over to the low tide times 1, and then we do the low tide times height as well. And then we go into the third column and we go into the high tide, because the first one was high tide, so the third one's going to be high tide. And then in the fourth one we do another check. If the low tide, so we've got this list through here of the low tides, if there is more than one, so it's above 1, so there's 2, then there's going to we've then got some information that we can put into the next low tide. So that means we've got 4 of them. But if there isn't, because we started high, low, high, that's 3. So we don't know whether the low tide is going to be the one that's either going to have 1 or 2 in. So if it hasn't, we don't print anything. And then we just do it in reserve. So that's one scenario with if the high tide time is lower than the low tide time. But if not, then it's reverse. So the first column that we start putting data into is the low tide times 1. So we ignore the first column and start putting the things into there. So that's what that's doing at that point there. Now to revert for that, for when we actually come into our tables, I think that was table 2, wasn't it? So when we look at the tables in here, again, it's reading this first time. And if this first time is less than this first time, then it goes into the high column first. If this time here is less than that, so therefore it goes into the low tide. So that's how it actually organises the thing through there. And then we've got the check of it comes through, and it says suddenly we go low tide, high tide, low tide, and then it does the check. Is there only one high tide, or is there more than one high tide? There's only one. Okay, then we'll leave it blank. And so that's how it works through there. So it works well. The logic works well. Now, me trying to explain that to Bing, it doesn't working at all. In the end, I actually had to take it to a point and then do that working out and create that extra 0, 1 on the end to use that as the logic to actually resolve it. Just going back to Bing, and after creating this data set like this, the other thing that I was doing, so one of the things I was getting to Bing was I was taking part of the code, like the part that was actually just moving the tables around in the CSVs, rather than making the table inside of the PDF. I'd actually I used the thing where I was actually fixing the code, so I was getting right under the hood into the engine and just trying to fix it. So that's sort of like a white box approach where you actually dive in. The second thing that I tried with Bing was I actually just kind of copied this out here. I took a bit of this and I said, look, I've got a CSV file like that, and that's what it looks like. So I pasted that into the first thing in Bing, and I said, I want it, not like that one there, sorry, we can just jump back to the other one. I want the output to look like that. So I copied that out. So I said, that's what I've got, that's what I want, write me something that will do that. And this was quite an interesting approach. It actually taught me something else. Now, the first time it did it, after I'd sort of got this organised and using it, it's one of the fluffing around a bit, is it did it by data frame. The second time it did it by series. The third time it did this weird iterative thing. So it gave me 3 different solutions to the same thing using the black box approach. I just kind of said, this is what I got, this is what I want, write me a Python script. So I could then choose them. But since I'm quite comfortable with data frames, I suddenly thought, no, I'll stick with data frames. I'm happy to use those. So I ended up getting the data frames up to a certain point where it's semi-working, and then I started to dig into the rest to actually try and resolve it as well. So I got the tide times through there. So at that point in time, and then I printed, and I suddenly said, well, okay, then I'm going to colorize the columns. I'm going to make the header a bit different. I'm going to give it a title on the top of the thing. So I ended up with my, where is it gone? I ended up with my PDF, which is doing, whoops, wrong one. Now I'm getting confused again. I've got my Tides 2 PDF, which is at this state here. So I got that one through there, and I suddenly thought, well, okay, then I've got the table. I sort of put the graph aside, and I thought, no, let's go and have another look at the plot. So this morning I've been cranking away on the plot. One thing I just want to draw your attention to, again, as I said, I found Bing was very good at doing a lot of the formatting, and the fact that I'd actually decided to set it up as a class, in some ways, I think another time I'll say just write it out as a function type thing, all on its own, and let it do it that way. For doing the layout for the FPDF2, one of the things I did find through here, so where's that? When I didn't have Unicode in there, so when we get the Unicode, what we end up having to do is we have to use a different font. We actually have to bring this Deja Vu TTF font in to do it, and then highlight where we've got that. I talked about that in the previous video. But if I'm not using that UTF font, I can do this. PDF is equal to PDF, and then I can give it an orientation of the paper source, so it could be portrait or landscape at an A4, A5, or A3, or A2, or A1, or whatever, and the units, etc. So I can actually modify how my paper size fits. But when I use the Unicode, it doesn't let you do it like that on the first line for the PDF. So I think you actually have to build a page further down. So it was just an odd little thing that I found. It was working perfectly, and then I actually had to revert around. But since the default is an A4 in portrait mode, I thought that's fine. So I was sort of reasonably happy with what I'd actually done at that point in time. And I did actually have a little image down the bottom, but I ended up suddenly saying, well, okay, then let's start cranking on the on the tables, on the graph. So this is another thing I find Bing really good at. Now I know with MatplotLib I find it really fiddly trying to get the things, and I sometimes stuff it up. So in the end I suddenly said, look, make me a plot, will you? And messing around and getting the formatting where I can get this not as much white space on the sides and on the head, and being able to read these and rotate this text around and split the text around, so I've got a major axis which actually gives the dates and a minor one, and then to put the shading in between, and to give these light dots all the way through for certain heights. It's brilliant. I find it so good, and it really speeds up my processing of actually being able to do that. And then it was putting all of these points bang on dead center on the peak of where the points would be, and I said no, shift them all across. And another one that actually happens now, I just want to talk about the tides themselves. Now I did watch a couple of things on videos and stuff like that, and some of the videos were sort of good and stuff, but there's an explanation that I thought was quite handy of stuff that I've done already. So there's a tutorial on this somewhere, is that we'll just hop into the earlier one through here, and I'm just going to call up my turtle one. So this is a turtle orbit one, which I actually did where we were doing planetary orbits, and I think it's quite an interesting one to look at. So as we move around, you've got the Earth. Now when I was actually looking up some stuff on tides, the moon, because it's so close to the Earth, has a very big influence on the tides. Because the moon's so close, although it's smaller, it has an influence about 2.8 magnitude, 2.8 waffly, who cares what. the sun also has quite a strong influence on the tide on the Earth as well. The other planets do, but they can be close or not, so they can have some influence depending on where they are, and their distance depending on their size, mass, etc., etc. But the sun has an influence of about magnitude 1. So we have the moon and we have the sun. So if they're in line, in other words, the sun's this side and the moon's this side, in other words, the moon is to the sun's side of facing to this. So this would be when there was a new moon, because the sun it would be pretty stark, so it's pretty hidden there. So that tide will be very big. Now, when you've actually got the moon on this side and the sun on this side here, so you've got a magnitude about 3.8 pulling in this way. So you're going to get a very, very big tide on this side. So during the seasons, this would be one of the biggest tides because of the fact that these two are in location. So the next one that we can actually get, and I'll actually just wait until it comes around through, there is there. So this is one where you've actually got the moon on the opposite side of the sun. And so the sun's pulling 1 on this side, and this one's pulling 2.8 on that side. So that's pulling 2.8, but that's pulling 1. So really this is only pulling about 1.8. So that means it's going to be a smaller tide on that side, but this will influence. So this will be a slightly higher tide. If the sun and the moon were on the other side, then if the moon was on this side, close to the sun, then the low tide on the other side would be seriously low at that point in time. Then you can get the other scenarios through here. Oh, sorry, let me just press one again. We'll ignore this one, we'll let it spin around so that it's easier to visualize. There. So this is where the sun's pulling this way on it, but the moon's pulling this way. So they're this is doing magnitude 2.8 this way, and this is doing magnitude. So it's sort of pulling the water in a vector of this sort of direction through here. So the tide's not going to be as big, because this is sort of dragging the high tide this way a bit, and they're sort of like in opposition to each other. So this tide here is going to be different. So this is through different seasons of the different times in a way. So the moon's taking a month to get around. So the moon's getting around. So once a month, you're going to actually have the moon and the sun lined up on this side at a new moon phase, and when you've got a full moon phase, when the moon is on the other side, then they're in opposition. So it's going to be a spring tide. I think they're called spring tide, but it's not going to be as powerful. Then you've got the moon, which is in the half moon either side, whether it's half moon waxing or half moon waning, of which the tides are going to be not as high. Now, that's just going through on a month as the moon circles around the Earth. And then you've got the month going around the sun. You've got the Earth going around the sun, and that's going to take 360 days, so you've got 12 months. So you've got 12 of these spring tides, of which the moon and the sun are both on the same tides, which is going to pull it up. So there's certain tides when they're going to be a lot bigger than other ones. Then there's going to be these other high tides where they're at an angle. Now, each day, the Earth is spinning through 360 degrees. So if I go 1, each time there, that's spun around again, and the moon's in a slightly different position, and the sun's in a slightly position distance. So each time, they're not necessarily at their highest or their lowest, but they're in between. But on one side, it's going to have a stronger influence, and on the other side, it's going to have a weaker influence as it spins round. So this is where you're going to get 2 high tides and 2 low tides, depending on things are. So when we actually look at the graph on here, you'll see not all of the high tides are the same. Some of them, like these ones here, are up at 0.52, and this is only at 0.41. This is down at 0.31. So there's times when the sun and the moon are having combined influence, and then there's times when they're sort of in opposition. And you see on these ones here, you see this is only, the other thing that I added to these is an amplitude. So this is from the distance from the 0 up to 0.9 plus the distance from there plus the 0.6, so the total is 0.95. So you see on these ones, this has got an amplitude of 0.98, this one's got an 8.4, this one's 9.5 because it's the thing. So you get a sort of a low high tide and then a high tide each day, and then a low high tide and then a high tide, and the same with the troughs as to where they come. But throughout the month, you're going to get higher ones and lower ones as well. So I think this is something that I think my graph here shows better than this graph here. This one's too subtle, or this graph isn't big enough, and it doesn't have any horizontal lines to really indicate. But if I hover over that, that says 1.6, and if I hover over that, that says 1.7. So I don't know how it's actually doing the tide, because if you read this one, it kind of says it's 0.7, and then this one is the 0.7 plus, you know, whatever. So if you go from 0, and this is maybe minus 0.7, and then this is whatever. So I think they actually have a base, and then they say from the base that is that much, and then it's that plus that to give me the high tide, or that to the mean sea level, or whatever. I'm not too sure. So I think I still may have a couple of things read me wrong, but I've got the data in the right format as far as it's structured in the right way as the lows and high tides and things like that. My numbers are maybe not correct, like these ones are actually plus, and so maybe I need to do some alterations on that. But to a certain extent, it was more about fitting the data in. At this point in time, I actually want the data so that I can take it out with me, and then I can actually make my own personal observations based on what I've got as far as that goes. And I sort of think, oh, I can think about it a bit more rather than just doing a quick screenshot and forgetting about it. So at this point, I'd actually made a table that looks a little bit spiky, and I was actually quite pleased that this sort of could mentally explain to me about the differences of where you'd actually get different sequences, although this one I think it doesn't orbit in 360 days, and that might be something to motivate me to come back here and be a bit clearer on what that thing there's doing. And I do like the way it does seem to explain some of the things with tides. It'd be nice to get a spin on that. So that was a little exercise I did. So the next part here was to actually create this tides table through here, and then the last thing was to join it. So we'll just quit out of that. We'll quit that one. I don't know which one is running it. And if we look at the final tides table, we've got the image at the top, and then we got the plot at the top, and we've got the thing. If I hover over it, you'll see it turns yellow because that's a clickable link, and if I click on that one, it actually takes me to the other tide table. And it was really, I can put a link on that, but I don't think it's that useful. So looking at the fact that since you're getting these very high tides and very low tides throughout the month, depending on where the moon is, maybe only doing 10 days is not so good. Maybe, like this other one through here, I should be doing a whole month, because this one definitely highlights the difference between the high tides and the low tides and whatever. I don't think it actually has moon phases. Oh, here we are, the moon rise, and this is suddenly saying first quarter. So here's last quarter. So here's full moon. So full moon is when the moon is behind the earth, and so the sun's shining full onto the moon, so that's why we can see the reflection of it. Whereas if it's a new moon, can we get a new moon? Give me a new moon. It's too early, we can't quite get there. But a new moon down here would mean that our tides would be even greater than when so therefore that would be a new moon, so that the moon and the sun are both on the same side, so the tides would end up being a lot greater for that. So in some ways, doing just 10 days of tide, I should go back to my original API and suddenly saying, well, no, instead of doing 10 days, I should do 28 days. So that would give me the whole spectrum. and then maybe I can actually also combine when the moon phases as well, so that would link in together. So that's maybe another exercise through that. I just want to draw your attention to one thing, because I don't really want to do anything more with the PDF that I think so at this point in time. But one of the things that I thought was quite good is when I'd actually got the images through here, I'd got the Unicode through here to actually have the phases of the moons on this one. So if I just come up to here and go into the phase of the moon. So I've got the first quarter, all of these ones, wax and crescent and all of those. But they're all black and white, although the actual emoji symbols are actually in colour. But what you can actually do that I've noticed inside of here, further down, they've actually got an image column. So you can actually bring coloured images in. So I can actually get a whole lot of new moon, first quarter, all of those phases, and actually put them in as a separate image on a separate column or something like that. So there's the potential to do that as well. So I haven't bothered doing that, and I suddenly thought, oh well, there's an opportunity there, because that's one of the things I think on this table. It doesn't really stand out, but having a separate column that actually had an image that was a colour image saying when it was full and when it was half or something like that would visually be easier, a better clue. Plus some shading as well would be quite interesting. So there's a few things that you could do to enhance that coming through. Now, from the point of view of what I'm doing with these ones, oops, I've gone and lost it now. From the point of view of what I'm doing with the ephemeris and stuff, I had a first crack at that, I had a first crack at the plot, I had a first crack at the moon stat theme. In this one here, I'm extending a little bit further and trying to do some colorization. With the previous one, I was using a different. I wasn't using the other gentleman's class for doing a table. I was just using the standard FPDF method of doing a table, and I can start doing some enhancements to actually make them visually, one, consistent with each other, and two, easier to read, especially the ephemeris, which has got very tiny text and very small, and I think there might be a way of actually adapting some of those things as well. So for this point in time, I'm sort of happy where I've got with this. So it's not the end product, but the next thing I do is I glue this in, so I've got this inside my automation procedure, which will then generate this one on my server, and then it will send me the email, and those the tied ones will be joined at the very bottom at that point in time. But it gives me a time to think about it. And for other people, it's really, I'm testing a lot of these things, is suddenly saying, well, yeah, I can take that and I can see what he's doing there, but I want different colours, or I want to do this, or I want to do that. But a lot of those things have been tested, so you're sort of seeing some of the potential that can be done. The next one that I want to go on to is with weather, I think. So that's quite a useful one to do. Now, when I was thinking about this, I was suddenly thinking, oh, but how does that fit into the other one? Well, I actually sent myself an email first thing in the morning to do with the electricity prices that I've got. And in the morning, I'd actually want the moon and the sunrise and the sunset one. And I'd also want the tides, because I usually have that for looking up in the morning to see when I should plan to take my dog for a walk if I'm around the house. And so on. I could get the weather one, because again, usually the information I want that first thing in the morning. For the planetary stuff, I normally create that in the middle of the day, but I can actually have the ephemeris, and I can actually have the sun and the moon, sunset, sunrise, and the moon stuff all there, as that's a handy package if I'm going out and doing some looking at stars or looking at planets, and doing the evening walk and seeing what time sunset is and stuff. And I also noticed on this one here, if I go back to what it actually has, not only has it got sunrise and sunset, it's also got moonrise and moonset. And I suddenly thought, well, actually I think I might already have that in the table, but I should actually pull part of it out so that I can get that as well. So from the point of view of the process, I've tried to sort of add value to do things. It's not as elegant as a lot of these other websites and things like that, but that's just a tiny wee project that I'm just working on my own to actually have a bit of data that's bespoke, so it's relevant to me because it's based on where I live. So the next one that I'll be doing is heading on with doing some exploring with some weather ones, and I prefer to maybe see how I can get some information and display that too. So I hope you found that interesting. If you found it useful, please give a thumbs up. I will put the codes up on Google so that you can actually download them with the video. I always find if you've got something that works, in fact that's quite useful from the point of view of what I do, is that I do the API call and I write it to a CSV file. And then the second part is actually reading the CSV file. So if you haven't got the API or you don't want to log in on that particular API or do anything of that, you've got the data that you can do all the rest of the things. You can actually create the table, and you can create the graph anyway from the data that's in there. So those will actually generate that from the CSVs. So I hope you found it useful, and as I said, please give a thumbs up. Control out.